President Trump promised to crack down on illegal immigration, and right now that means immigrant families are being torn apart when they try to cross the southern border in certain areas. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy calls for prosecutions of any immigrants caught trying to come here illegally, and that means parents who cross with their kids are being taken to jail, and their kids cannot come with them. We now know that nearly 2,000 children were taken from their parents in the last 6 weeks alone. Now, those kids are being held in detention facilities like this one in Texas. Next week, the House may consider legislation that they say would ensure families crossing the border can stay together, because even some Republicans in Congress right now believe these policies are going too far.
Are you comfortable with the current zero-tolerance policy leading to parents and children being separated at the border?
No, I'm not. We don't want kids to be separated from their parents.
And let's be clear here. Before now, children were usually allowed to stay with their parents in the detention centers while awaiting legal proceedings. No party has enacted any law that forces authorities to separate families, despite what President Trump falsely claimed this morning.
The Democrats forced that law upon our nation. I hate it. I hate to see separation of parents and children.
I'm joined now by Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McAleenan. Commissioner McAleenan, thanks for coming on. Let me start with this. What are the orders that you've received, and where did they come from, that says you must separate all asylum seekers no matter where they're coming over the border?
I think it's important, Chuck, to start with a little bit of context of what we're seeing at the border. We're in our third month of over 50,000 people arriving, crossing between the ports illegally or arriving at the ports without documents. These folks have taken a harrowing journey, spending $5,000 to $7,000 per person with some of the most ruthless criminal organizations in the world, drug cartels that have diversified their business to then involve themselves in human smuggling. So they've suffered extreme risk. They're held in stash houses. They're put in semi-trucks in 100-degree heat. It's a tremendously dangerous experience, and we unfortunately see hundreds of people die on both sides of the border every year during this journey, and the Border Patrol makes thousands of rescues every year at the same time. So that's the cycle that we're seeing. Over 250,000 kids since 2014, 320,000 family groups arriving, and we need to do something to break that cycle.
Okay, so the policy got changed. Who ordered it? Who ordered the change in policy?
So you've referenced the Attorney General's decision to go to zero tolerance for immigration violations. For over 10 years, the U.S. Border Patrol has had a consequence delivery system where you try to apply consequences for violating the law. An immigration violation, crossing the border illegally, is not a victimless crime. It puts those individuals at risk. It puts the Border Patrol agents trying to interdict them at risk. And it creates chaos in the border communities where you have people in failure to yield situations, high-speed chases. You have people in semis. It's not a good situation on any
Okay, why is
level.
it so hard, though, in this detention center, for instance, the one that the media was allowed to tour, why is it so hard to keep families together there?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because that's exactly what Jay Johnson did as Secretary of Homeland Security in 2014, the first time we saw a crisis like this. We didn't have family residential centers where families could be detained together at that time. He made the decision, because of these risks that they were facing, because of this cycle of violence and danger for these families being enticed into the system by our immigration laws, he decided to detain families and repatriate them after their immigration proceedings. Unfortunately, a year later, in 2015, a district court judge interpreting a 20-year-old settlement between the INS and several plaintiffs determined that we could not detain children, even if they were accompanied by their parents, for more than 20 days. They can't finish their proceedings with due process in 20 days. So it essentially forced release. So we don't have that tool in our toolbox to keep them together. That's what the administration has asked Congress to fix.
Are they trying to generate a crisis here?
Absolutely not.
Because right now it didn't feel like, right now there's this, it feels like a humanitarian crisis that we had one way of dealing with it before that felt a bit more humane. Everything you described, it's sort of like you're describing this harrowing journey, and you're describing a lot of empathy, and then you're taking their kid, then you take the kid away. That makes it 10 times 1,000 times worse.
The crisis existed before 6 weeks ago.
I understand that, yes.
It was a humanitarian crisis for these people being enticed into this smuggling cycle. No question about it. What we don't have is that ability to keep them together. A better system, and the administration has asked for Congress to change the law to allow us to keep families together through their immigration proceeding, make a good, swift, fair decision, and if they need to be repatriated, they'll be repatriated. If they meet the asylum criteria, they'll be allowed to stay.
What is the process when a child is separated from their parent right now? Are they allowed to say goodbye? What kind of contact is allowed? I mean, we have gotten anecdotal stories
Sure.
of some pretty. It doesn't feel very compassionate.
Right. Now, I'm very concerned about the anecdotal stories that have been reported. Our Border Patrol agents are compassionate. These are men and women who are parents that got into law enforcement to protect people. That's why they do their job. Over 50% of them are Latinos and Hispanics. These children look like their own children. And so they're doing this in the most humane and civilized way they possibly can, explaining to the adult, you violated our laws, you're going to be prosecuted. It's not a permanent situation that you're going to be apart from your child. But we need to take you to court, and your child's going to go into the care of Health and Human Services, professionals that deal with children every day.
So what is the? Can they say goodbye? What's the?
What do you
try to do?
HHS and Department of Homeland Security just put a fact sheet up that explains the process, that explains who to contact for parents to try to reunite with their children. It explains how advocates and family can also get information and support the process.
Do you have enough manpower?
Actually, no. We need more Border Patrol agents and more CBP officers. We have a tremendously broad mission. We've got security.
I thought you got a whole bunch of new funding. We did get a bunch of new funding to hire new people, right?
Well, we got money for another 328 officers in FY18. We're making good progress. We're now starting to hire Border Patrol agents more successfully again. So, yes, we're asking for and receiving support from Congress on personnel.
If the president asked Attorney General Sessions to essentially change the zero-tolerance policy, how fast could you change the way Border Patrol handles asylum seekers?
Well, more helpfully, if Congress would close the double standard on how we treat kids, depending on where they're.
I'm trying to be a political realist here. I know you're not a political guy, but guess what?
No.
Congress is not going to pass anything in an election year. All right, that's pretty clear. We're now in this no man's land of political paralysis. If the president sort of orders Jeff Sessions to change this policy, could you implement it quickly?
We're an operational law enforcement agency. We respond very quickly to direction.
Do you find it harder to do it this way versus how Jay Johnson had you do it 4 years ago?
Absolutely. This is tremendously challenging for law enforcement professionals. They want to be out on that border catching smugglers or bringing hard narcotics in to threaten our community.
So this is actually taking resources away? What you're doing now by having to separate these folks, this is taking resources away from being able to worry about the bad guys?
Those resources were already obligated to catch the families and children and process them that we're coming across. So there's no further impact in our resources. What we'd like to do is have them either apply for asylum at ports of entry, which is a lawful way to do it, or if we could close these loopholes to have a much more consistent system where they're not trying at all.
You're probably aware of this, but at the port of entry, the line is so long, they're being told don't even bother. So they're in a catch-22. You're telling them don't come in between ports of entry, and yet, the line is so long. Some people are alleging that it's being slow-walked at ports of entry in order to encourage discouragement. I know you're dealing with a lot of these kind of allegations. What's going on at the ports of entry?
Yeah, that's not the case. We do have capacity issues. Take a port like San Ysidro, over 130,000 people a day arriving at that port of entry, the busiest in North America, one of the busiest in the world. It's also the site where most of the hard narcotics come into the U.S. Through the southwest border, in personally owned vehicles, in compartments, in gas tanks, in axles. So our officers have a tremendously important mission there to facilitate that lawful travel and to find those drugs. So we're trying to make sure that we can accommodate people arriving without documents, process their claims for asylum lawfully, but also balance it across all of our missions. So sometimes people do have to wait a little while.
What is it that you need Congress to do that would make your job easier?
We need to close, for the border security perspective, there are three main issues. It's the double standard on kids. Kids from Mexico are repatriated swiftly, and it's a very small percentage of unaccompanied children coming across.
This is not a Mexico issue, despite what the president says. This is a Central American issue, isn't it?
Central America and further away, but primarily the Northern Triangle of Central America. Secondly, we need to end this catch and release practice where families have to be released within 20 days. So they're not coming to their court hearings, and we can't finish that process. We'd like to keep them together in custody. And then third, the asylum gap. At the credible fear level, where 80% of people are being found, you might be able to prove a case for asylum. But then years later, when they see an immigration judge, that's down to 20% results. So that gap is creating an incentive to come illegally.
All right, Commissioner McElhaney, I know this is a challenging time politically, policy-wise, and for the folks on the border, thanks for coming on and explaining.
Thanks for letting us talk about what we're doing.
I appreciate it. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.